Welcome to Rev'd Up for Sunday, a lectionary podcast from the clergy of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in New Canaan, Connecticut. I'm John Kennedy.
And I'm Peter Walsh.
I'm Elizabeth Garnsey.
And we are in Luke chapter 18, moving through ordinary time. And what do you know? Jesus has returned to his favorite punching bag, the Pharisees, in one of his classic parables of reversal, where the righteous man goes home, apparently with his prayer rejected, and the sinner, the tax collector, has his prayer accepted by God and is justified by God. So let's hear the passage. This is Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. I love that Luke returns to this teaching from Jesus. It came up in chapter 14, all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Perhaps I loved it because I've quoted it in about 5 sermons recently. But as you might know, if you've heard any of those, this has certainly long been, and all the more has become a favorite teaching of mine from Jesus. And here it's given its own parable. I think that's really what this parable is. It's an illustration of that teaching.
Yeah. It's interesting how the biblical scholars talk about this as coming from the Q source, because it ends up in Matthew and it ends up in Luke, and these aphorisms that clearly come right from Jesus, this question of humility, and so peppered throughout all of his teachings. I just have to say that my looking at the parable this time leads me to a place where I'm even less comfortable than I ever was with such a parable and such a teaching. Not the beginning and the end where Luke frames us and tells us what it means, but in the parable itself, where you get, obviously, there's a trap in here, right? And the trap is so unbelievably easy to fall in, which is you get this, the Pharisee is sanctimonious and hypocritical, and the tax collector is repentant and humble and justified. And then you find that once you take the side of the tax collector, you fall into the exact trap of the sanctimonious Pharisee, and you've stepped in the exact bucket that is being judged, that you end up judging. So if you throw yourself into the parable and start judging in the parable, it's very easy to find yourself, ironically, in the place, the very place that is being judged.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, Peter, that I think it's the punching bag of the Pharisees has become tradition's punching bag. We love to kind of get on that bandwagon and say, like even Augustine went a step further to call the tax collector a Gentile, that he was so far from the horrible Jewish Pharisee and got to be the one justified. And, he just added that gloss onto the pictures in a way that that Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, I don't know if you
she's
know
great.
her. She's so great. And she uses this as an example of the easy anti-Semitism that has come out of some of our readings over the tradition, like from Augustine's time and all that. So we have to be careful. And then the, the fact is Jesus, I think, was always trying to overcome the dualism of of his day and ours, that we like to have a winner and a loser, and here we're set up to think there's a winner and a loser, but there's the possibility that to be humbled and exalted, they end up in the same place, and they're kind of like both going down justified. And this word rather than in the Greek is para, alongside, like together with, And so one translation, which is in some of the original manuscripts, but not original, but some of the kind of early translations was, this man went to his home justified alongside the other. So like they would be even more frustrated. The listeners would be even more frustrated that Jesus would cast these two in the same light, that God doesn't really compare us with one another, but we have some work to do on not even making these categories anymore. I think I'm just kind of restating what you said, but
interesting.
It's been thought about that way. Yeah.
That is fascinating.
It is. Yeah. It's a twist.
Yeah. I don't know, because Jesus, I think, is pointing out that trusting in oneself, in one's own goodness, in one's own ability to observe the law, is a trap, and because a trap precisely because you think that if you are a Pharisee, that you think that here is the law, here are the commandments prescribed by God, I keep them, I fast, I tithe, I am not like people who fall short, I am not like people who have gone astray. That I think Jesus is holding this up as an easy trap to fall into.
Self-righteousness.
Yeah, and self-righteousness. I think he is really teaching against it. I don't think he's saying that the Pharisees' approach is okay. I don't see that at all.
I don't think that that's quite what I mean, that he's saying it's okay. It's just that to think that he is fulfilling the law. He's actually a perfectly glowing example of a good guy, right? I mean, he, as you said, he fasts. He gives twice, fasts twice a week and gives 1/10 of all his income.
Right.
And it's his self-righteousness that blinds him to the idea that he also has fallen short in whatever way. But, when you get to Paul, all have fallen short of the glory of God, and yet all are justified.
It's
true.
Well, also Paul goes on to say, Paul does brag and boasts, right? I mean, Paul boasts in his Pharisaism. I was this, I was that too. It's kind of funny. And there are parts of the Hebrew scriptures where boasting is considered appropriate, and certainly in the Talmud too. So this is the kind of built-in bias we have against the Pharisee, where the Pharisees have become our punching bag and a caricature, when in fact, when you start to peel it back, this is another example of Jesus catching us off guard. So the Pharisee would have been the good guy, not the bad guy, and the tax collector. I mean, Jesus is messing with people all over the place. Remember the last podcast we did where the widow was the one who was, going to give a black eye, and now we have a tax collector who's a bad guy who is super humble with his eyes down. So at every turn, Jesus is unsettling us. And that's what I took away. I'm like, this is super unsettling. I don't think there's no easy place for Peter Walsh to land in this parable at all. There's no place for him. There's no place for me to sit down and go, oh yeah, I got this, dude. I'm on.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I agree with that. I mean, and to the difference between how this landed and what it meant in its time and what it's come to mean, particularly with regard to the question of anti-Semitism, I think is really important. But also important to say that everybody in the story, we presume, is Jewish. I mean, interesting that Augustine would identify the tax collector as a Gentile because he was certainly collecting taxes for the Gentiles, right? For the Romans. But my sense is that this is a Jew doing this.
Yeah. I think that's the right reading.
Right. So everybody,
but somehow he found a way to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is unfortunate.
I know.
To put it mildly, but these are everybody in the story is a Jew, obviously, including the teller of the story. Yeah, it's like it was a trap for the Pharisees to, through their observance, to fall into this trap of self-righteousness. It's absolutely a trap for us to say, those Pharisees, and to label people we differ with and don't like as Pharisees. It's a really interesting thing. I have to say, perhaps maybe as somewhat of a younger priest with a more recent seminary experience, I've recognized sort of a trend to sort of defend the Pharisees, and I'm a little skeptical of that project because I don't think that this way of being religious is good, frankly.
No.
Trusting in one's own virtue and character, and priding oneself on not being like other people's. I mean, if the Gospels are wrong in this depiction of the Pharisees, then like, why do we trust the Gospels at all?
Mm-hmm.
It might be a question we might ask. Like, I'm going to go with this overall characterization, and I'm going to accept that it's a mistake, but it's a mistake that I am also very liable to fall into. So it's a very, very tricky thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue here is a deeper spiritual issue.
Yes.
And this is all the pitfalls of religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Using a what von Balthasar calls a ego drama versus theodrama. Using religion for your ego drama rather than the theodrama is what's happening here. But I think that there's a few things that are really underneath it that for me, just as I process it, are really, really, really cool. The first is that, this, I keep bringing this up, do not judge. That's if I had to pick out one teaching of Jesus in the last 4 or 5 years, for me, that's the biggest one. Do not judge, do not judge. And so here we get a guy, as you said, it's comparative righteousness, he's judging. And the inner Pharisee, his Pharisee has as an air of superiority, which is clearly, that is Jesus teaches clearly against that. But I think the one word that leapt out for me in the whole teaching this time was contempt. We live in such a contemptuous society, and so much of the contempt, I'm sorry to say, pours out of the religious world. It makes me want to just not be a religious person when I hear the contempt pouring out of people who are claiming this contempt in Jesus' name. And when you take self-righteousness and you tie it together with contempt, it is unbelievably toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And the greatest teaching that I've stumbled on that lately is by a guy named John Gottman. I don't know if any of you are tracking on the Gottmans. The Gottmans, John and his wife, whose name I'm sorry to say I don't know, but they have a laboratory which they bring in couples.
Oh, I do know this.
You know
guy.
these people?
Yes.
And they bring in couples, and they've been doing this for 30 years, and they study this thing. And when you hear their discussion of when couples have a contempt between the two of them, it's curtains.
Mm-hmm.
Contempt is the ultimate relation breaker. You can have difficulty, you can have disagreement, but once contempt seeps in, he said, I mean, they put all of their research in numbers, and he's like, if this couple is talking and there's contempt, the odds of their getting divorced is 79%. I mean, he actually gives a number to it. And so I think what we have in our own country is contempt all over the place, and that's at the base of our division. That's the underlying toxicity in our division, is this contemptuousness. So it's trust, it's self-righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nasty, nasty thing.
Yeah, I think that's well said. One way I think we can benefit from a reading of this is to think about these two forms of prayer. I mean, they're both in a state of prayer, right, supposedly to themselves. Their words are kind of to themselves towards God, and in a way, it's one person. It could be any one of us praying both these prayers. Whenever we're in prayer, we can have all these thoughts going on in our head, and having all of us have a contemplative practice. How your mind races around, and at any moment you can be like this Pharisee, sort of, I got this right and that right, and oh my God, I'm such a loser and a worm, and or whatever. Like, we can both have these voices in our heads, or we can have both these voices in our heads, and I remember reading something like that from Richard Rohr, and he points out that the contrast with Jesus praying is that Jesus's prayer in the beginning of his ministry is, "You are my son, my beloved," and so the contemplative place to arrive at through all this morass of chatter of how good we are, how bad we are, and how blind we are to our goodness or badness, is to arrive at just a place of belovedness and surrender and letting go and letting God have both of these parts of us. And that's when we finally humble ourselves, But I think it takes climbing through all those voices, and we are these two people at any given time. ourselves.
Yeah, I really like that. But back to Richard Rohr. I mean, this was back when I gave that sermon on the divine love deficit disorder. I mean, I really believe Jesus is palpable. Mystical experience would be too small, but that's the category we have. Jesus' mystical experience of being the Son, the beloved one, with whom the divine, I am well pleased, with whom God is well pleased. That's the category that turns everything onto divine love. So he finds his whole satisfaction in that relationship. So he does not need to find satisfaction in a comparative relationship, where the Pharisee, who is religious, doesn't find enough satisfaction in that divine relationship. So he starts looking around for satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
And the other guy, the publican, the tax collector, who doesn't think he's got anything to offer, is the empty vial that gets filled. And so, I mean, I think there are these paradigms about how we might understand this. But I do think that once one experiences the fullness of divine being, a lot of this comparative stuff starts to fall away. Maybe not completely, but to some great degree.
Yeah, and to the degree that we stay connected, right? And
in
flow.
Yeah,
nice. Absolutely. It's a complete game changer. This made me think of Thomas Merton's false self, true self distinction, which I talked about in my last sermon about that strange pairing of teachings from Jesus. One is, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a tree, and then also that you're a worthless slave, right? How do these two things go together? In revisiting Merton's writings on the false self and the true self, principally from New Seeds of Contemplation, which is arguably his greatest book of spiritual meditations on the contemplative life. He defines the false self as a constructed sense of self based on comparison, wanting to be admired, wanting to feel competent, wanting to feel secure in oneself, as oneself, without reference to God. There's this very separating dynamic at play, and therefore, you're not going to feel that belovedness, that radiating love reaching down from heaven, as it did to Jesus in his baptism. And I love what you said about not therefore being satisfied and feeling a need to seek it elsewhere in this comparison game. And I think this gets at something so crucial for Jesus's vision, which was piety, outward performance and observance of your religion, of the law, etc., is basically worth nothing if it's not an expression of a vital living connection to God. And so he's taking it always back to the heart, back to the root. And that way Jesus is truly a radical at every turn, right? Because to be radical means to just always be returning to the heart of the matter, to the root of the matter. And I think that's a very clarifying lens for looking at this.
Yeah, that's good. Can I just pipe in on the first thing you said about the Merton and the false self and the true self? So the Pharisees, as I understand it, I would just say there, again, as I understand it, there are very few documents that show the Pharisaical movement in Judaism at the time of Jesus. The New Testament being a one of the primary sources, and as I've mentioned in the past, a man who I was in Israel with in 2010 has a master's degree from Yale Divinity School. He's a rabbi, and he was there to study the Pharisees. And so the Pharisaical movement, again, as I understand it, it derives its sort of the Aramaic word as it gets into Greek. It means separatist. And so the very idea of the Pharisee was to be separate. It's built into their understanding and their vocation. So, and that as they separate themselves out, their piety is a supererogation. I mean, it's above and beyond. The only day you have to fast is Yom Kippur in the scripture, in the Hebrew scriptures, but in the Talmud, the extra laws and understandings added through time, you can fast on Mondays and Thursdays. And the earliest example we have of this fasting is right here, is in Luke's of this, and we later Talmud writings will verify this. But the whole idea is separation. And I think when we get into paradigms of religiosity, into paradigms of divine being, And this whole question of separation, I mean, this is something you kind of feel like you've been hammering out for the 3 years I've been talking to you, which is anytime we separate ourselves from our divine being and our other people or the world, we run the risk of playing God and getting it all screwed up. Like, really, really missing the boat.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest stumbling blocks for reading Jesus is that we really want to see, it's really hard for us to not divide, even in like the best way, like even in this way, which it is clear that the self-righteousness is, the stumbling block. It's his blindness. It's the thing that makes him exalt himself, and that Jesus is calling out as a flaw in his way. But as the story plays out with Jesus, and we know that he goes into the homes of Pharisees and tax collectors alike, he befriends them all. He's compassionate towards them all. It's not like a zero-sum game where the Pharisees are all blind to their own fallenness, and the poor tax collectors are outcasts and therefore loved more by God or whatever. Like, we do these things in our, not we, but people, I guess. It's easy to see the categories that have been set up for us in terms of interpreting these parables and what's good and what's bad. So even the good, bad, insider, outsider, I mean, that's everything Jesus was trying to bridge, the end of the us versus them thinking. And I think that a parable like this challenges us to take the hard look at the possible other translations, like this rather than. In the Greek, it could be alongside, I mean, he could be playing with them so much so that if he's speaking to the Pharisees, he might say, yes, you have your place alongside, you have your place in the kingdom of God, and so does this tax collector. I just think we have to be careful that it's winner and loser.
Yeah. I mean, I think certainly from the divine perspective, the tax collector and the Pharisee are loved equally, right? There's no differentiation in that divine, unmediated, unfiltered reality, right? God just loves. That's the being of God. It just radiates outwards. But I do want to hold on to what's commonly called the preferential option for the poor, as a scriptural motif literally from Genesis to Revelation. Because I think that because of how messed up we are as human beings and how we structure the world and how the poor and the outcast are disregarded, abused, neglected, suffering all the time, right? It's the oldest story in the world. I think that there is something worth upholding here about, in terms of God's dealings with human beings in the mess that we've made for ourselves, that in some real way God does prefer the outcast. And it's really interesting here that outcast and poor here is expanded to include a tax collector, because he doesn't fit that category in a straightforward way. He's actually collaborating with the emperor, or with the empire and the emperor, the Roman Empire. So it's a very interesting stretching of that category. But I think it goes to show you that it includes anybody who is outcast and stigmatized in any way, like the lepers we saw in a recent story. So I do think that's important to hang on to. And therefore, I think this ties really importantly into how I understand Jesus' teachings not to judge, which to me doesn't take away the validity and even imperative to recognize sin in the world, pride, greed, exploitation, violence, and to name it, and not to say, well, I don't really know what's going on in that person's heart, so I'm gonna just, I'm just gonna stay in my lane. No, I mean, the way that Jesus models is to name it, right? How many times does he call Pharisees hypocrites, for instance? So that's an interesting thing, but to not judge them at the level of casting them out of your heart, right? To still recognize them as a human being created in the image of God, who God loves, who God wants to restore to communion with God and all of us, right? That's what the image of Jesus, going to dine with these people who he nonetheless is liable to call hypocrites as well.
Right.
It's a lot to hold together.
It is.
But those are some of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of when I was saying that I found that my studies in preparation for our conversation made me no easy landing place anywhere in the parable.
Yeah.
And even that, I mean, this is trial by prayer, right? This is a court scene. And, he uses the word, he says, in that line, I tell you, which is, that's Jesus, those who have ears to hear, listen up. This is a solemn beginning to that sentence. This man went to his home justified rather than the other. And the question of justified, I mean, this is a trial kind of paradigm. Justified comes from the word justice. And he uses the phrase "this man" just as it was formerly used as a derogatory phrase. Luckily, I'm not like this tax collector, and so I mean, this story, Luke tells the story. I mean, this is so artfully told. The more you plunge in, the more you go, and that you can only be justified by God alone, which we might get, echoes in Paul. We get echoes in the Psalms. And this divine reversal that's a part of it. I mean, here the punishment is laid out, and that's where you get that closing aphorism, which is those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. But if you go one level, if you say, okay, I got it, clunk, 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 as you're saying, major teaching. But then if to go to the next level, that the proud are humbled so that they might be able to receive the divine gift of their very being and the being of love, and not fill themselves with all the ridiculousness of our Merton's false self. And so the ultimate game, the ultimate divine game, is to bring us all into communion with the divine being. It's just that some people need to be laid low so they can be opened up to receive, and others who are so low are able to be received and be pulled up. So there is underneath it a whole understanding, I believe, that God humbles us so that we might receive the divine, the flow of the divine being. Out of the believer's heart shall flow streams of living water, that we might receive the living water, which is way better than the muck that we drink about ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, Paul is an icon of this, right? Paul is a Pharisee. One of the great verses that tell us in such a concise way about the ethos of the Pharisees is from Paul's speech at the end of the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 26. He says, I've belonged to the strictest sect of our religion and lived as a Pharisee. So there you have it, right? Just confirming what we already basically know. And Paul is literally humbled. Because to be humbled is to be brought down to the ground. He's knocked off of his animal on his way to persecute Christians out of his misguided religious zeal and devotion. And through that humbling, blinding experience, right, blinded by the light, he's a transformed man, and he receives grace, and he becomes the apostle of grace. So I think that's totally right on. And
his transformation is one, from the religion that says he can go kill in the name of God,
yes,
to one that says don't kill anyone, right? I mean, and so I think that's the great leap. Brian McLaren has a great book out, which I think was 2016. He wrote this book called The Great Spiritual Migration, and maybe you've read it. But he talks about, we've gotten through all these images of God, from the God of genocide and violence up to now the God that teaches us, provides for us, helps us love one another. But our world has kind of stopped short at the God of, God is love, as long as we are in the tribe, or like we're in good standing, right? And otherwise we can still go out and convert others by violence to our way. But what the world needs, what we all need to come to realize, is that God is this one that doesn't call for the ousting or killing of anyone. No. And it's difficult, but that was Paul. He laid himself down for that, but
I just want to respond once. I know
that today.
We're coming sort of toward the end, but I mean, this is the tricky thing about religion. So in an act of complete comparative religiosity, I'm just going to tell a story of a good friend of mine who, when asked how he is, he will say something like, "Oh, he's just a miserable sinner." and has nothing to offer, and living in the flow of grace, and says all this stuff, and then turns around and is like so judgmental, it's enough to make your hair fall out. And so this is what I mean. You can these two guys as paradigms are a tricky place to be here. If you're really going to glue in on them and just back then. Yeah. Sorry about that. And I know that is comparative questioning, but just to say that this religious stuff can be super tricky.
Yeah. I mean, I think that goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about what it does mean and doesn't mean, or what it might mean and might not mean to not judge, as Jesus teaches. And I think he's not saying don't be clear-eyed about these sorts of dynamics as they're presenting in the world. Right. I think that's okay.
I agree with you.
And just a more positive presentation of the prayer of the tax collector as it's been practiced over the many generations, basically since just after biblical times. Just worth saying a little bit, I think, about the Jesus prayer. We mentioned this recently as well, but I think this is perhaps the primary biblical source for this prayer of the heart, this contemplative prayer that grew out of the early monastic movement in the desert in Egypt and Syria and so on. And these desert hermits, following Paul's teaching to pray without ceasing, used this prayer of the tax collector as a mantra. And so much more to say about that, but so many spiritual writers over the years have testified to its power to really bring about a stillness of heart, a receptivity to grace, to divine love, and to really transform one's whole being.
Thanks for bringing it up. And to say again, The Way, the Pilgrim is such an incredible book on that. I did have a conversation with Rowan Williams once about this prayer, and he has practiced it for many years. The attestation in the Orthodox tradition about the power of this prayer is straight up. This is a mystical doorway.
Yes.
And I tried it for maybe 7 to 10 years, I think. And I was in St. Paul's in Cleveland Heights in the Tower with Dare Cox, who was my spiritual director. And I was talking about the troubles of my prayer life, which is what you do in these things. And I was telling her about this prayer. You know what she said to me? Is being a sinner your greatest preoccupation with your life with the divine? I said, no. And she said, so then why have you spent 7 years calling yourself a sinner if that's actually not getting to the heart of what you want to talk about?
Yeah.
An incredible comment.
I get that.
Because I thought I was going to be an Orthodox mystic, and it turned out I was not. And I was just like a dude from upstate New York trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
It was so normal. I didn't have any of the gifts.
I mean, if you substitute a sinner for, a child of God, it might be even more transformative to pray that for 7 years, to recognize our belovedness. And I know that's like a soft pedaling Protestant thing to say,
I think it's just a different sort of frequency, which and they're both true in a way. But I mean, I totally agree that if a spiritual practice isn't bearing fruit, we're under no obligation to practice it. That's
anyway. Sorry about that. I hope
it's helpful because people are really all over the experiential. There's not a one size fits all formula.
The sign that a spiritual practice is worth sticking with is that it's bearing fruit.
Yes.
In our lives, making us more like Jesus, more loving towards God and towards one another. And towards ourselves, right? But also interesting to note that the sinner part seems, I'm no expert on the Jesus prayer, but my understanding is that the earliest forms of it were shorter, and it was more like, Lord Jesus, have mercy on me, something like that. And the sinner part, which is scriptural, right? It's here, got added maybe or standardized, a more standard part of it as the centuries went on.
Not everybody prays it with the last comma.
Yeah. So give it a try, perhaps, with and without the sinner part.
And I know we're finishing, but can I just say that I mean, my experience of the prayer, I think, was also not only that, but I think at some level, with my desire to pray without ceasing, as was laid out in Thessalonians, that it involved not only my desire for union and communion with the divine, it also had a kind of pride element in it too, a Pharisaical element where I thought I can muscle my way into praying without ceasing, and I was unable to muscle my way into praying without ceasing, and I tried with all my pride to make such a thing to come about, and it didn't happen. So I had to go to Romans 8 to pray without ceasing, which is size too deep for words that don't involve my consciousness. But anyway, again,
I'm kind of with you on that in a lot of ways, but I guess we should dock the boat as Rob is pleading with us to do, begging us to have mercy.
Right.
So thank you for bearing with us, just as Rob has to bear with us, and have mercy on our long-windedness, and hope there is some value in all of it for you, as there surely is for us, and value for us in hearing from you. So please leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our journey with the Scriptures and with Jesus, and we will see you next time.